Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lincoln University, welcome to Lincoln Innovation Events, welcome to the Excellence Series. My name is Wim de Koning. I will be doing the health and safety with you, so those who already know me know that I sound like a broken record when I do these things, but welcome, emergency exits. We do not expect any fire drills today. So if the alarm goes, it is the real deal. If the alarm goes, we will follow and we will gather at Ford's Lawn. That is the piece of grass behind you guys. There are exit doors out there, but of course, if there is danger out there, we'll take this door and we either go to the right or to the left. There are enough Lincoln University staff here that will guide all our guests to a safe place. Toilets go out the door, and it's basically the area that you actually look at. The red doors will guide you into the toilet area. After the talk of Professor Tim Smith, we will actually offer you some refreshments. Those will include alcoholic beverages. We would really like to remind you that the people that you are leaving at home really want your home safe. So please do drink responsibly. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Grant Edwards, the Vice Chancellor of Lincoln University, to introduce Tim.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, and good evening, everyone, and welcome here. Welcome to the Lincoln University Excellence Series, and a series of talks dedicated to celebrating the academic reputation of our esteemed professors here at Lincoln University. Through this series, we aim to engage and contribute in the debate on many of the critical issues facing our country and our communities, and showcase the impact of world-leading research within the land-based sector. I'm delighted to introduce this evening our Professor Tim Smith as he shares his research on vulnerability and adaptation. Tim is the Dean of the Faculty of Environment, Society and Design here at Lincoln University. His extensive academic career includes roles at the Australian Research Council as a Future Fellow, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Business and Law, and inaugural Director of the Sustainability Research Centre at the University of Sunshine Coast, where he has also been awarded the title of Emeritus Professor. Tim is a human geographer, just wait a minute, specialising in coastal management, water security, and climate change adaptation. Tim's research focuses on vulnerability and adaptation, contributing to sustainable livelihoods worldwide. He has received the Australian Museum Eureka Prize for Innovative Climate Change Solutions and is a Fellow of the Institute of Australian Geography. Welcome, Tim, here this evening.
Thank you, Grant. Eka mano, eka reo, eka ho, eka tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Steve Early pointed out the photo and said, who is this guy? He's a little bit... Now, I've got a lot of slides, but I'll go quickly through them, but happy for anyone to interrupt as well. So I'm going to talk about vulnerability and adaptation. Now, I also saw this image that was used for the talk, and I thought, oh, that's a little bit dramatic. But then when I think about some of the communities and species on the planet that are actually facing extinction, you know, perhaps this isn't so dramatic to those. Now, this might look like some dystopian water world future, but it's actually Fenwick Island in the US. So these are sorts of issues that are happening right now that are dramatically affecting many, many communities around the world. We look at our climate change emissions, and none of this is new news. They continue to rise despite the numerous IPCC reports, despite the numerous Conference of the Parties meetings. When do we say enough is enough? I co-authored a commentary on this with colleagues from Massey University and Waikato University, Bruce Blovich and Ian White, where we're talking about the tragedy of climate change science, where we made the point that over the decades, you know, we've had compelling evidence of change. Over 270,000 papers on climate change. We've also had numerous attempts at advocacy. You know, I think when this was taken in 2019, there were 7.5 million people involved in climate protests around the world. And obviously there's been numerous international conventions, yet we see year on year emissions rise. And it's not only climate change, you know, we are often obsessed with climate change, but there are numerous other indicators of decline, biodiversity loss, for example. Now, I'm a geographer, so I'm really interested in this idea of relationships between people, place and change, particularly trying to provide the knowledge base, the evidence to build resilience for sustainable livelihoods. Now, before I get into some of the projects and findings, I just want to outline some of the key concepts that I'll be talking about this afternoon. So the first concept is vulnerability. And we often talk about vulnerability, but we don't actually unpack what we mean by vulnerability. Apologies. Now, the IPCC love really detailed definitions. Like, this is incredibly complex. But when we unpack it, vulnerability is essentially about harm or the potential for harm. They also love these very complex diagrams to explain their complex definitions. I actually preferred it when the IPCC provided a very simple explanation of vulnerability. They essentially said a few years ago that it was a function of exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And what we mean by that is that our exposure to things is like, for instance, increased temperature. Our sensitivity is how we cope with those sorts of things. We know that an ageing population is more prone to heat-related illness, for example. So the combination of those things creates our potential harm, but we can offset our potential harm through building our adaptive capacity, through building social networks, for example. So it's a combination of those three dimensions that results in our vulnerability. So a lot of my research has explored vulnerability through looking at sensitivity and adaptive capacity, because the dominant focus of past science has been understanding exposure. What are the temperature changes? What are the sea level changes and so on? Not so much on the sensitivity to those changes or our ability to adapt. Now, adaptation is essentially just the process by which we can expand our coping range to reduce our vulnerability. So this graph could be anything. It could be heat, it could be rainfall, whatever it is, we adapt to extend our coping range to reduce our vulnerability. Now, some of the key assumptions that have been made is that vulnerability is about harm, but it's also being construed in a very negative way. Vulnerability is always something bad, something that needs to be resolved. So some of my research is unpacking this. Is all vulnerability bad? Or do we actually need some exposure to vulnerability to be able to learn and adapt over time? So adaptation is the reduction or removal of harm. But another one of the key assumptions that we make at the moment, sorry, Shannon.
That's fine.
Is that adaptation is externally focused. Now, when we think about adaptation and how the term was first used by Darwin, it was about organisms modifying themselves. It was about internal adaptation to external environments. But we never use that adaptation in that way now. We're always talking about us doing whatever we want to do, and we'll modify our external environments. So some of my research is also unpacking what sort of implications this change in focus of the way we understand adaptation might cause. So why is it a problem? Well, I think we have this normative language of right and wrong, what's good and bad. And we also have this modification of these historical definitions that we're modifying to suit our own needs. What we also find is that a lot of adaptation occurs in isolation. So we're not taking a systems perspective to looking at how different forms of adaptation interact. Now, there has been this term maladaptation that's been used, which is about saying that some adaptation has unintended consequences and might actually lead to perverse outcomes. And one of the other issues is that we're looking at lack of transformation. We're essentially operating in a business as usual paradigm. And this is driven by this trying to always modify our external environments to suit our current way of operation. But what we've challenged this notion of adaptation is through a paper that we did on manipulation about 12 years ago now. We were saying perhaps we should better term adaptation as manipulation, because we're essentially manipulating our external environments. But because we're not looking at the concept of adaptation critically, we're not unpacking what manipulation might actually do to these sorts of systems. So we hypothesise this relationship between manipulation creating exponential social ecological stress and at the same time reducing our capacity to adapt. We're removing ourselves from authentic learning experiences through manipulating our social ecological systems. So these are some of the ideas that I've been exploring throughout my research. So just to give you a bit of a background on some of these concepts. Now, I've been working on these issues for over 25 years in a range of countries all over the world, all facing significant issues. So from flooding to coastal erosion and impacts to impacts on agricultural systems and livelihoods. Today, I'm obviously not going to cover 30 plus projects in 20 plus countries, but I'm going to just highlight a few of these key issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first project on a regional approach to assessing vulnerability in the Sydney region. I'm going to move to looking at the Mekong Delta, and then I'm going to come back to Australia to talking about a national project that I've just finished looking at adaptation in rapidly growing coastal regions throughout Australia, and also just mention a new project that was started in the Pacific. So in Sydney, this was the very first project looking at a regional approach to assessing vulnerability. It was essentially a city project, but what we were doing was really trying to map relative vulnerability. So looking across those dimensions that I mentioned before, exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, to look at relative vulnerability to a range of different hazards across the Sydney region. Now, this is where a lot of vulnerability assessment work stops, with a mapping of vulnerability. And it's very easy to communicate these sorts of high-level results. But we went one step further, where we were looking to actually try to understand, well, what's causing this vulnerability and where can we make key interventions in the system? So we ran a range of participatory workshops in Sydney to try to conceptualise the system, looking at the drivers of change, the relay variables that might magnify or dampen the impacts and so on. And we came up with a range of these horrendograms, which are truly horrendous. But using this approach, and we used Ben Simmer modelling software to look at these drivers of change, we're able to look at the impacts of things on, say, infrastructure, what the direct and indirect impacts might be, and then to flip this on its head to say, well, what's actually driving these impacts? And often it was some of these indirect impacts that had pervasive effects throughout the system. So using this approach, we could identify the key issues where you might want to make interventions into the system. And we came up with, as you always do with these projects, pithy titles for action: know your enemy, plan for change, get smart, and so on. So this was the very first project done at this scale. This was a project that, as Grant said, was awarded the Australian Museum Eureka Prize for Innovative Solutions to Climate Change, and really laid a lot of the foundation for my future work on adaptation. We did a range of these. We looked at a range of different sectors in a range of different places: horticulture, grazing, urban areas. But what I was really interested in was, what's the relationship between people and these sorts of drivers of change? And in particular, places that are undergoing very rapid change. And this brings me to the project in Soc Trang in Vietnam that was funded through GIZ, which is the German aid organisation. Now, the images here show what you would typically expect to see in Soc Trang province at the bottom of the Mekong Delta. But Soc Trang is undergoing very rapid change. It's obviously highly agricultural, 84% of the land use. but it's got a very rapidly growing population, highly urbanising. You can see a 50% increase in urban dwellers over this 18-year period. So 29% of people now live in urban areas. And obviously a huge change in the workforce towards manufacturing, trades and construction. So a very dynamic, rapidly changing environment that's also got a huge range of issues to do with climate change. So we know in Sok Trang there's like huge impacts. They're already getting saltwater intrusion into their paddy fields, huge impacts on livelihoods and sustainability. But this is the current face of Sok Trang now, highly urbanised. So we were looking at identifying the issues here, analysing the capacity to address the issues and providing recommendations on improving management. And we took a similar approach to the Sydney project here, participatory workshops. Obviously this is in Vietnamese with simultaneous translation, and identifying a similar horrendogram. And again, in this case, looking at key issues like storm surge, obviously into the agricultural areas, what the direct and indirect impacts of an impact like storm surge might be. And then similarly, looking at what the direct and indirect drivers of change might be for an area like Sok Trang. But then we also went on to look at, well, what are the preferred futures for an area like this? What do you do in an area that's undergoing so much rapid change and getting so much impacts from climate change? So we looked at this futuring approach and worked through looking at, if you were to achieve your preferred future of a sustainable livelihood, what are the core capacities that you would need to underpin them? And I put up this image here because it's actually a similar picture to many of the studies that I've done. We often assume that education, finances, and so on are the key drivers of change. But in fact, human capital, social capital are the key things that underpin effective adaptation in many of these contexts, particularly contexts that are undergoing rapid change. So if I jump back now to the Australian example, the study that I've just finished, where we looked into more detail about some of these contextual nuances around vulnerability. This is a study looking at coastal governance around Australia. And again, it was focused on vulnerabilities in the most dynamic places throughout the country. So there was one case study in each of the jurisdictions, each of the states. They were the fastest growing local government areas, and we chose the fastest growing suburbs within those fastest growing local government areas. So you can see here Shell Harbour, 50% growth, Torquay, 60% growth, Phrygian Springs on the Sunshine Coast, 350% growth. These are dynamic contexts, rapidly changing, not too dissimilar to Selwyn, I should say. So what we're interested in, these are just examples where they are situated around Australia. And just to provide some of the insights from this, there were obviously a range of biophysical vulnerabilities that we identified, coastal erosion, sea level rise, as you would expect, but also a range of socioeconomic vulnerabilities in these case studies, particularly around things like stresses relating to diabetes, for instance, and so on. We wanted to unpack some of this because this is just a top level assessment of vulnerability. But when you dig deeper, there's some other sorts of pervasive trends that we're not picking up on that are having dramatic impacts on these sorts of communities. This is trends in wealth, for instance, over a almost 20-year period. And what we can see here is obviously that the highest quartile of wealth is obviously increasing at a much faster rate with virtually no change at the lowest quartile. So huge inequities that are being created. We also know there's huge rental crises, and we're seeing that here in Aotearoa as well. So some of the factors affecting community resilience in these areas are things like access to food, homelessness, social isolation, mental health, drug and alcohol abuse, and domestic violence. It was amazing when I did an interview with one of the service workers in Maroochydore on the Sunshine Coast, which you look at Maroochydore and you think, well, this is a paradise. This is like a tourist hotspot. And he told me that within 100 metres of where we were talking, there would be 100 homeless people sleeping that night. You know, so there are these sorts of things that are just hidden from view And they're the sorts of things that we're trying to unpack with this study. What we found was that vulnerability is not negotiable, but the adaptive capacity, our ability to reduce harm, is highly negotiated. The socio-ecological systems are essentially destroyed by inequities. And what this results in is both extreme but also pervasive vulnerabilities that cut across multiple sectors and scales. So what we require is a systemic change to dealing with these sorts of issues. You can't just say there's going to be sea level rise in this area, it's going to affect these crops. We need to look much more holistically at solutions to dealing with adaptation and vulnerability. Now, it's very difficult to communicate these sorts of qualitative results. It's much more easy to show a graph of a quantitative set of relative vulnerability, for instance. So we tried to take an innovative approach to doing this and tried to use the words of some of the key informants in terms of a poetic inquiry into these things here. So this is a range of different participants throughout Australia with the poem Erosion. But it really depends. It depends who you are. That divide, absolute imbalance. I always choke up when I get to this bit here. Tell the kids, mum and dad aren't eating. That'd be change. It's really shocking. This was a common story across a lot of the case study sites. This was published in the Geographic Journal, and there's a whole range of these sorts of stories of inequity. But it's these sorts of powerful messages that I think create resonance with decision makers. It's all very well and good to say, you know, these people, you know, were homeless, or these people were experiencing inequity, you know. But I think a lot of the results actually showed that a lot of this was hidden. You know, a lot of the people were saying that you could look at this house here and it's got a perfectly mown lawn. You would have no idea that if you go inside, there's no food in the fridge. So it's these stories that come out when you actually talk to service workers in these places that are undergoing such rapid change, where people can't afford to rent anymore and they have to move out. And I think it's the same with all sorts of systems that are undergoing rapid change. There's this extreme, pervasive vulnerabilities that get created that we need to really think about how we're going to manage. And this is, I think, when we look at these things, we look at them from a very micro scale perspective of them. And we don't look at the bigger pictures affecting these sorts of communities. So another study that I did was on tourism and looking at the focus of tourism studies globally. And most of those studies were focused on the micro scale, absolutely oblivious to the major macro drivers of change. And I think a lot of the vulnerability and adaptation work that's being done is ignoring these macro drivers of change. So why is it important? And I think one of the key things is that we're in an environment at the moment where we've gone from government control of things towards co-governance models, and now a shift in dialogue towards more community responsibility for things like dealing with hazards for adaptation and so on. But we're seeing this within a vacuum. How can people improve their adaptive capacity when they're struggling to survive? So we need to think really carefully about this devolved governance approach without a similarly devolved access to resources. So cross-cutting findings across all of these projects are really that vulnerabilities are inherent. They're an inherent trait of all communities. They're not necessarily all bad. A lot of vulnerabilities aren't critical, but the critical vulnerabilities are often created through these structural and systemic factors. They're not inherent, they're created. But there are a range of innovations to overcome vulnerabilities, and I haven't spoken much about the findings around innovations, but what we found were that the innovations that were the most successful were the ones that were cross-sectoral and cross-scale. So they weren't just focused on just providing food, they were focused on providing food within a broader structure of providing shelter, providing opportunities, providing work, and so on. But similarly to the Sok Trang example, that these innovations had to be underpinned by human and social capital. They were the key forms of capital that underpin successful adaptation initiatives. Now, one of the projects that we're just embarking on, again, it's another highly dynamic environment in the Western Pacific. We're doing a project looking at water security, and this is around subsistence communities on the high islands in the Pacific that are going to be forced to relocate. The project team has extensive experience in the Pacific. I co-lead the project with Professor Patrick Nunn, that was at University of South Pacific for 25 years, and Rosalind Kumar, that's a Fijian national as well, with a range of people from CSIRO and University of South Pacific. This project is interesting and important because most of the people in the Pacific that have been the target of research have been on low-lying atolls, if you like, the charismatic megafauna of natural disasters like the panda bear was, and so on. So, but what we find is that most of the population don't live on low-lying atolls in the Pacific. They live on high islands. So there's been very little focus on this. But what we know is that in the Pacific, sea level rise is rising at 2 to 4 times faster than global averages, particularly vulnerable to extreme hazards, as we know. And there's obviously already current issues of saltwater intrusion, communities already relocating in the Pacific. So if we look at what's happening in Fiji and Vanuatu, the two countries we're focusing on, we can see that the majority of the population live in the coastal zone. 76% in Fiji within 5 kilometres, 90% of Vanuatu within 5 kilometres. When you're looking at a lot of subsistence agricultural communities that are on these flat land areas on the coast, they're going to be dramatically impacted by climate change. So what we're working on is looking at what can we look at in terms of working with communities here that are going to be forced to relocate. So we recognise as well that water security is the key issue underpinning agricultural livelihoods in the Pacific region, and that you can't just rely on freshwater supplies, they have to be supplemented with groundwater resources. So we're going to look at a range of case studies where people are in the process of relocating, where they have relocated recently, and where they've been relocated over hundreds of years, to look at what some of the success factors might be. So in summary, that's just a bit of a nutshell of some of the projects that I've been working on, some of the insights in relation to vulnerability. And some of the takeaway messages are really that social ecological systems are inherently dynamic. We can't pretend that they're not. We can't pretend that they're static. Vulnerability is inherent, but critical vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, are created through external conditions, and building social and human capital is really the key to ongoing learning and ongoing adaptation and success over time. Thank you very much.
An excellent presentation there. There's ample opportunity for questions at this point in time. First, if you just state your name, please. And
yeah, I'm here at Lincoln University. What's the definition of human capital there? Is it experts in the field, or is it the educated public, or how would you define that?
So it's yeah, exactly. So we usually look at capitals in a range of ways. So financial capital, built capital, environmental capital, social capital, human capital, and then there's a range of others, political and so on. So human capital is essentially the skills, education, and so on that someone might have either individually or collectively within a community.
Oh, Rainer Hoffman, also at Lincoln. So I've just come back from the Pacific, and it strikes me that communities are at the core there of adapting to challenges. And at the same time, I think you mentioned that devolution from governance, higher governance, to communities is a bit of a problem. Could you please expand on that?
Yeah, I think, look, I'm all in favour of devolution, as long as devolution comes with some degree of empowerment. So you can't expect people that are, as I mentioned, struggling to survive to be able to have agency to create positive change, right? So devolution needs to come with the same sort of transfer as well of power, resources, and so on. So I think that's where we need to move to if we are looking at true devolved decision-making approaches.
resourcing as well as empowerment.
Yeah, resourcing is a part of empowerment, definitely. So with the Pacific project, that's just phase one, where we're looking at some examples in Fiji and Vanuatu, and then the idea is then to scale that up and embed it within national policy around a relocation strategy. And like I said, the focus has really been on moving people off island, whereas what we're looking at is local relocation and what's the best way to support that, because that's where the bulk of the adaptation will occur in the Pacific.
Jim Moore, big news. How much success have you had in getting the authorities to take notice? So looking maybe at Sydney one, which is quite a defined. Have they taken it on board?
Yeah, Sydney was really interesting because it was because it was the first study looking at vulnerability and adaptation. We were very paranoid because, you know, at that time, like that was in the mid-2000s when we started it, you know, there was a lot of climate denial going on. And there were a lot of politicians that were running on climate denial platforms. So we were quite paranoid about it, but we thought, well, we've just got to do it anyway. And what we found by the end of the project, we actually had local governments successfully applying to the federal government for funding to develop broader adaptation strategies. I think of the 15 coastal councils included in that case, as case studies, I think 8 of them had successfully got federal funding to develop adaptation plans by the end of the project. So certainly they were taking it into account. But, you know, they're dealing with different sorts of issues to the issues that we're dealing with here. You know, I mean, there are some similarities, but, you know, and a lot of this is also driven through capital investments and so on as well. So there are some underlying reasons for why people apply for funding too, but certainly it had impact in the region. Yeah. And there was obviously a big shift in terms of voting, as we've seen now with the election of the Teals, you know, from those regions where we were doing the study. I'm not saying we cause a link there, but certainly there's you don't get so many climate deniers being elected to government.
Tim Curran, Lincoln University. Just following on from that, Tim, I was fascinated by that earlier piece of work that you did where you, I can't remember the title, but it was basically a concern for climate scientists, and you sort of showed, you had this era of evidence showing the impacts. There was a swathe of other things like the period of activism as well too. Do you have hope that we will get there? And if so, what gives you that hope?
Well, I mean, you have to have hope. Sure. What other choice have you got? But, yeah, look, I think I try to be positive. I mean, I'm pretty cynical. I'm cynical even at the IPCC. You know, I was a lead author on the last report, and before COVID came, I was kicked off because I refused to do the long haul flights to lead author meetings. So if an organisation like the IPCC can't even take it seriously, what hope for the rest of us got? So, you know, I mean, I think there is, you know, people want change. I don't know. I think it's hard. It's hard when you're looking at those global emissions continuing to rise, and also because we're so focused on that at the moment. You know, we're ignoring things like this. We're ignoring the world ecological footprint. You know, and so on. Loss of the Living Planet Index has shrunk from 1 to 0.6. You know, these are other things. Loss of biodiversity is just as significant as the climate change crisis, yet we're not getting traction on any of these things. We did get traction when we were looking at the ozone hole, right? So, you know, so that does lead hope. It was a much more simple fix, you know. It wasn't where people who had vast amounts of wealth tied up in petroleum, you know, we're going to go down. But we did see dramatic and very rapid change. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's difficult for me living through the flooding in Brisbane in 2011, 2012, where there was 75% of the state of Queensland underwater, and yet there was no transformational change in dealing with those sorts of climate events. You sort of think, well, what has to happen? Another flood, no change. Bushfire, no change. So I'm not sure. I mean, we're tinkering around the edges. We really need this transformational change. And that's what I'm talking about. We can't look at adaptation in isolation. We need to take a systemic approach. We need to look at the fundamental structural conditions that we need to create this transformational change. I know I've gone round and round circles and I haven't said, yes, I'm optimistic. I remain optimistic.
Tim, I have a question which is in relation to the commentary around Selwyn district growing rapidly and in comparison to those studies in Australia. What do you see as the vulnerabilities in Selwyn?
It's an interesting, it's a really interesting question. I think in Selwyn we're probably seeing, well, first of all, there's the obvious in terms of fragmentation of landscapes, right? We don't have an interurban break between Christchurch and Selwyn anymore. In my mind, that's a terrible problem that we should be trying to rectify very quickly. We are just seeing an expansion of suburbia through Selwyn. Now, that's going to have dramatic impacts on all sorts of livelihoods, connection to place. I think just people feeling like they're not part of what they knew, what they were. So I think, but we are on the same, on the flip side, we're seeing huge injections of wealth into Christchurch and Canterbury more broadly. So, you know, these things are difficult to reconcile, but what I see the future for Selwyn, if we keep heading on the same trajectory, is we will see this divide in equity. We'll see more inequity growing. We'll see more people being displaced over time. So I think it is something that we need to really carefully manage, and particularly look at the core values that we want for Selwyn, as you're very familiar with, and what is the future we want for Selwyn, and how are we going to protect and ensure that.
There's one here and then a few more coming.
There's multiple locations I work for. Kind of subsequent to follow on from Tim's question, the thing that really puzzles me with this in space is this kind of duality between us and we talk about the natural world, or we kind of save the planet. And I'm kind of going, the oxygen we're currently breathing is the natural world. So how much do you think this kind of, do you see this duality when you're dealing with people and working in this space? And if you so, how big a contribution is that, do you think, to the kind of challenges we face?
Yeah, I think it's central. This idea of people in nature as opposed to people of nature, I think, is a really critical concept. But yeah, we're talking about other species now as being more than human, you know, rather than other species. So I think it's, you know, a lot of this has been discussed a lot in the sustainability learning literature for a long time, where we've gone from learning about nature to learning through nature to learning for nature. And I think, you know, moving that's why I think learning is really critical to this process, and moving towards systemic thinking, systemic learning, where we have to recognise that we are fundamentally part of a social ecological system. And even our thinking around resilience has gone in the same way. It used to be an engineering perspective, went to an ecological perspective, and now it's dominated by a social ecological perspective, recognising those exact things that you're talking about.
Thanks, Tim. Roy Montgomery, same as Tim. Two things. Can you go back to the slide that has Pippa in the Huddleston in the?
Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned Pippa. And they're all doctors, by the way. Now there were 4 PhD students attached to the Sydney project.
Pippa's a student from our faculty and did the Bachelor of Environmental Policy Planning honours degree. So there you go.
Yeah.
Those of you in the room that are.
So Pippa has just had her thesis accepted. She is now a doctor. I think her graduation will be in about 4 or 5 months' time. That's a really good circle. I actually started supervising Pippa before I had any conception that I would be ending up at Lincoln. But and in fact, there's a number of people from Lincoln I've worked with over the years. I saw Gary before, and he said to me, "I've got Erin Smith's master thesis in my cupboard," and Erin was one of my postdoc fellows as well. So yeah, Pippa's a success story, I think, at Lincoln. Amazing
But since you've got the title and the piece of research up there, I'm curious as to how you relay that back to the communities that you mined or quarried or surveyed, participated with. Like,
So this project resulted in 29 journal articles, and we produced a one-page research insight PDF for each of those 29 papers. All of those are on the project website, and we also contacted all the participants and gave them links to all of the information on the website, followed them up as well. So we involved them directly in the study as well as through feedbacks with project findings as well. Many of them have contacted us saying that they'll be implementing different components of the project in their daily activities, but you know, it'd be interesting to see how it evolves over time. I mean, that's the trouble with doing these projects. You know, you come in and you work with people, and then it's difficult to see what the long-term impacts are. And I think it's something that Grant's particularly interested in, is how we actually measure our impact. There's a few ways of doing that, but it's something I think that we have to be taking more notice of, definitely. But if you're interested, if you just do a Google search on coastal governance, you'll find the project website. There are links to each of the 29 one-page PDF research insights.
I think there's a couple of questions up here, and then you, Hamish.
Thank you, Lua Flavor. This is Aotearoa. So, I mean, thank you for the presentation. Talking out comparatively, looking at the different case studies that you have. So I'm just wondering that, does the context, talking about urban, rural, developing, develop, the government structure and governance capacity make any difference in adaptation? And also looking at urban specifically, look at urban. You said human capacity and social capital, I mean, are the big things for adaptation. I mean, I think I quite agree with that. But now looking at urban context with urban commodification, financialization, and urban fragmentation, I mean, across contexts that you study, with human capacity and social capital be the main thing for adaptation. I mean, would they stand across context with others?
Yeah, definitely. So social capital, human capital, they were evident across all of the studies. But the way that vulnerabilities manifest is very context specific. So it does depend on context. There are different sorts of emphasis for decision making in different sorts of contexts, whether it's protection of infrastructure, whether it's protection of a particular industry, whether it's protection of a particular community group, for instance. Those sorts of things do manifest in different ways. But in terms of the cross-cutting drivers for innovation and adaptation, definitely social capital, human capital were the two consistent capitals for success.
And we'll have one last question.
Hamish Rennie, comes back with this piece. First, I'd like to congratulate you on the recognition of the word resilience. I heard you say it once, but congratulations on that. In the resilience research, there were times when people, usually wealthy or middle class people, argued that the social capital and human resources of the homeless, the poor, and so on was such that they were actually more resilient to disaster than the more wealthy, who had more to lose, who were less used to relying on their own resources. And so I wondered if a source of future hope might be this increasing inequality, means that more and more of us going to have poverty, and therefore more able to cope with.
It's interesting because so the initial research on adaptive capacity was identifying these generic determinants around finances and so on that are found not to be true necessarily. And this goes back to my point about that not all vulnerability is bad. Some level of vulnerability you need to be able to know how to respond to larger perturbations in the system. But, you know, obviously if you've got resources, you're able to extract yourself from a situation as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept. You would not sure where else to go with that. but certainly there are thresholds, and I think that's what's important. You know, there are thresholds of poverty that once you go below that threshold, you definitely will be vulnerable. You know, if you're living in your car, you know, and you're not able to self-organise to do basic things, you know, you're going to be vulnerable to these sorts of changes. But, you know, you can look at communities throughout Southeast Asia, throughout the Pacific, that are very resilient to these sorts of changes. But then you say, well, what is the cost of that resilience as well? So there's multiple dimensions to understanding vulnerability and resilience, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tim. An outstanding presentation and some really great answers to a set of questions there. I'd like to thank the audience for coming along today, and also thank Tim for his outstanding presentation. And we just join together and okay, and we invite you to some drinks and light refreshments in the foyer of Wānaka.
I think fire.